Alright folks, welcome to my little cell tutorial. Today we are going to be going over every single one of these cells. However, I'm going to be splitting it up into a couple of short videos. That way it's a little bit more digestible. Let's go ahead and start off with some basic cells. Folks, welcome to Primordialis. Today we're going to dig in deep on every single cell, talk about their potential use cases, and exactly what they do, so that way you can be a little bit better informed on which cells to choose on your Primordialis adventures. Note that I'm not going to go into too extreme of detail with some of these cells because many of them are very subject to change. One of the good examples of that is Amplifying Cell that has been completely reworked like 4 times over in 2 months' time, which is just insane. So yeah, we're going to give you a basic outline of what the cell should be expected to do, where you want it to function, and maybe some creative use cases, because some of these ones are going to be significantly more wonky than others. And yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. We've got our first starting cells available to us here. This is obviously not the starting shape, but this is the starting stuff. We've got spikes, we've got seeker cells, we've got basic cells, and we've got hearts. Let's start off with spikes. They deal more damage based on velocity. They deal more damage when there are more pieces exposed. So if you've got a spike like this, since it's got all these hexes exposed, that's going to do more damage than this, for example. And all of these would be doing decreased damage. Spikes deal damage the longer they remain in contact with something, and they deal damage the longer, or the faster they're moving as well. Note that speed doesn't seem to play as big of a role as the continual contact. It seems like continual contact is slightly more important. So yeah, that is the basics of spikes. Let's go over their stats really quick. So they have a 5 biomass cost and only 1 biomass storage. And note that they also have a hidden drag stat. They actually increase the drag of your vehicle quite a lot, your little creature. So you can see we're going pretty slow. If I take these spikes off, then we are moving substantially faster. So sometimes a good way to get away from an enemy is actually to shed your spikes. And generally speaking, you only want spikes on your creature in the direction that you intend on attacking from. So what I often do is have spikes on the front, and then I have a movement design on the back. And that can be a really effective technique for moving around well. Obviously, this thing isn't very hydrodynamic. It's just a little ball, so that way I can explain all these things. So next up, let's talk about basic cells. They are your bread and butter. You can use these as filler, and they're awful. You probably don't want to use them outside of your first several levels, but they can be decent because you can get them en masse very easily. 1 biomass cost and 1 biomass storage. Biomass is your HP. And if we're going to be talking about HP, then we need to talk about the heart cell, because the heart cell is the single most broken cell in the entire game. Playing without it is extremely hard and not recommended unless you're doing it for a challenge run. So you can see that for 25 biomass cost, it gives you 100 biomass storage, which is pretty insane. That is an absolute ton of value. And just by comparison, the health infusing cell is one of the next highest biomass storage cells, and it's only got 5 biomass storage. And if we're going to be talking about heart cells, we should talk about the health bar. This white part of your health bar is how much, or like how long your cells are effective for. So when you run out of white health bar, you'll start to gray out. And when you go into this green part of your health bar, your cells will no longer function properly. When you hit this white bar here, you will die. So that is how the health bar works. And you'll see if I add like a whole bunch of hearts, it's going to increase this white bar, which is going to massively improve your survivability and your effectiveness. So having hearts is the key to winning this game. If you're struggling, I recommend more hearts. Obviously, there's such a thing as too much, but it's pretty tricky to get that with hearts, I think. As long as you've got, like, a basic function that you're achieving, you know, a little bit of movement speed, a little bit of offense, then the rest of that can be dedicated into hearts, and it's quite good. And you might be seeing that I've been playing around with Seeker Cells here. Seeker Cells are a somewhat more recent addition to the baseline body, and these are an absolutely incredible tool just for making movement significantly easier in this game. Obviously, you can control your unit with WASD, and you know, it's pretty good, but it also means that you have to really focus on how effectively you're designing your creature. If you have your creature designed in, you know, a suboptimal pattern, maybe it's optimal for combat, but it's not optimal for turning, or maybe it's optimal for speed, not optimal for turning, that is where Seeker Cells will come in. The more you have, the more pulling power they have. You can just hold left click and they'll send you in that direction, or right click and they can send you in the opposite direction. Another useful thing Seeker Cells can do is they can actually grab and reach, and they have some pretty interesting potential for movement and for, like, little arms. So yeah, they're incredibly useful for all sorts of things. Their final trait is that they actually have reduced drag. So if you want to go very, very fast, having your creature with a bunch of Seekers on the front can make it move very quickly. You can see, despite this being a more hydrodynamic shape, the reduced drag of the Seeker allows it to go significantly faster with this at the front, which is pretty cool. Next up, let's go ahead and talk about hard cells. Hard cells were recently nerfed to be even more drag heavy than they were before. Before, they already had a fairly significant amount of drag. Now it's even worse. Look at how slow we are moving with hard cells. They definitely come with a price, but that price is worth paying very often, especially if you're pairing them with good drag reduction or effective jets. Hard cells can be a fantastic way to improve your defenses. They're spike resistant and explosion resistant, which allows you to tank incredibly hard. And yeah, it's super effective. Note that it doesn't work like grounded cells. So grounded cells applies its resistance to shocks in an area, like an adjacency bonus. So basically with this, if I have that singular grounding, all of these hearts are also grounded. If I have a heart cell in the middle there, this heart cell is not granting its explosion resistance to all the surrounding pieces, which means that it can only be so much of a buffer against explosives. You're probably still going to want to build up some sort of chaff block or chaff material in between the hard cells and your hearts. Like, for example, basic cells do it decently, but I would say light cells do it even better, because light cells, for the same cost as the basic cell, have incredible regeneration abilities. So let me go ahead and find something to bump into here. Here we go. So if I bump into this thing, because it's got reduced health, it gets eaten very quickly. You can see that. But you can also see that it's regrowing immediately as well. It is still costing me life, so it's pretty risky. But depending on how you've designed your creature, light cells can be very, very effective as just like an inner layer from your hard cells, at least in my opinion. Next up, let's talk about the structural cell, Slippery Cell. Slippery Cell is sleek and squishy with very low drag. That is honestly the perfect way to describe it. If you have drag cells, your movement is going to get very drifty, and you can go very, very fast with drag cells. Next up, we've got the Speedy Cell. Speedy cells are exactly as they sound. They make you go faster. They make you go faster in every way. They make you turn at a ridiculous rate. They make you move forward and backward faster. They are just a really, really nice one to have. especially when you're starting to get larger. The larger you get, your turn radius tends to slow down quite a lot, depending on the shape that you're going for. And yeah, Speedy cells can help with that. Note that Speedy cells are 3 biomass cost, 1 biomass storage, so they are 3 times the cost of a regular basic cell. But I think that the speed boost is very easily worth it. This is just such a handy cell to have. I think it's really good. Alright, next up for the basic building block cells, we have the Flex Cell. So the Flex Cell is a bit of a weird one. It actually has the same reduced drag effect that Slippery Cell has. And you can see I've just pressed A once, and now I am just spinning out of control. It is very, very weird to try and control with an outer layer of Flex Cells. And obviously, not really how they're intended to be used. I would say Flex Cells are best used on longer creatures, and we'll see exactly how this interacts. So let's go ahead and grow a tail. You can see sometimes it like gets stuck in on itself like that. Oh my goodness, look at that! It's insane. I was just it just spins out. It just spins out like crazy. I use this thing, or the Flex Cells, very limitedly. Normally what I'll do is I'll use like a couple of layers just to get like a more snake-like design, something along this line. And then we've got like the segments here. Let me give it a little bit more health up here, because we want our center of mass to be closer to the front. And you can see that now we've got this extra bit of flexibility. Next up, let's go over some of our basic offensive options. First off, we have Sticky. This one is a bit more of a utility style, and a very handy one indeed if you're looking to do something a little more techy. So if you're looking to try and do some weird stuff, this could be one to choose from. I'm going to go ahead and cut the rest of this body off so we're back down to a more manageable form. There we go. So, if I were to... Let me give myself some seekers, because it is very convenient to move with them. There we go. So if I were to bump into a wall, I get stuck to the wall. If you electrify sticky cells, you can let go of walls, which is very, very handy. But you can also grab onto enemies and stuff and, you know, whip them with something or trap them somehow. There's all sorts of really interesting techniques you can use with the sticky cell. So definitely a handy one to play around with, but definitely not terribly useful on its own. You have to have a plan going in with Sticky. And you can see that it does increase your drag quite a lot as well, which is a bit of a negative. I find that like 1 or 2 sticky cells is oftentimes enough on its own. So yeah, just having a few is good. And also, another thing to note is that they actually do carry charge. So you can see that they carry electricity up to a point. That's something that I guess we will get into next. Because I forgot one of the other starting cells, of course, Ability Trigger Cell, which is what I was using to electrify these sticky cells. Ability Trigger Cell is one of those cells that is going to be just universally very handy once you get into the mid-game, and can be used to activate all sorts of different cells. The most important thing to note is that they do have a limited electrical charge. They can only charge so much, and there can be delays and stuff with it. Spacebar to activate, of course, it's a very simple tool, and not worth using unless you have electricity planned on your build. Pretty much every build should be using Ability Trigger in some regard, I think. Whether that is movement speed jets, or doing summons, or, you know, activating your sticky cells, or even, I mean, you could do electricity. The sky's the limit. Electricity is incredibly handy in this game, and ability trigger cells are very effective. One thing that you should note is that oftentimes electrical-based abilities will actually increase in power if you use more than one ability trigger cell to activate them. So it can be a really effective technique to experiment with different electrical type abilities to see which ones will actually scale up and which ones do not. There's no hard rules on which ones scale and which ones don't. It's just something you'll have to play with to learn. Alrighty. Next up, let's talk about leeching cells. Leeching cells have similar properties to spikes in that having them be a little bit pointier is pretty good, but not necessary. Note that leeching cells are actually non-lethal. They increase drag, not as much as spikes, but they can be a pretty effective way of stealing life from enemies. Yeah, they're decent. They're okay. They're not amazing, but they can be a nice alternative source of healing at times. So while I've got this HP bar down, if I were to sneak in here, and here, let's take some damage. We'll take a little bit of damage here on the front. Oop, come on. There we go. And then if I run into them, you can see that we are regenerating life, even though the regen bar hasn't completed. So that's pretty handy. And eventually that will consume all of their HP, which is pretty cool. Leeching is really neat as well because you actually get to lifesteal past your full health and you get like a bonus overheal, which can be pretty handy on lighter heart builds. Personally, I feel like leeching is rather weak, but it can be used as a nice utility for keeping drones alive. If you put leeching on your drones, they will be able to leech life and potentially stay alive significantly longer than they would otherwise. So that is pretty helpful. And yeah, leeching, it's just okay. Definitely not my favorite offensive tool, especially since they're non-lethal. It makes them pretty awkward to use, but they're okay. Next up, Venomous cells. Venomous cells have been buffed and nerfed and buffed again. One thing to note about Venomous cells is that they do have good reduced drag, and they also have very interesting mechanics if you do like a long piece. They can be very spindly and very effective at catching enemies. So one common technique that I've used in the past is having some sticky mixed in with some venom, so that way the enemy kind of gets wrapped up in the sticky, and then they get envenomed, and then they can die very quickly. This isn't a very good example of that, but, you know, if you set it up right, it can be a pretty effective technique. You can throw in some spikes in there. I've got some previous runs that show that off. If you want to look at the Dredge, that is a great example of a build that abuses venom and sticky together. Note that venom is one of the very few cells that has its own biomutation modifier. So if we look at the mutate pool here, mutagenic poison will transform afflicted cells with 20% stored biomass or less into the next cell type you upgrade. Depending on what you choose, it can completely change the way you play the game. And yeah, just for an example of a really good combo, if you were to apply poison to an enemy, and then their afflicted cells gets transformed, let's say, into a breakaway cell, and then you electrify that breakaway cell, it essentially just deletes the last 20% of their health bar, which is absolutely absurd. So yeah, very, very interesting and fun to play around with, but tricky to apply enough of it for it to be effective. Note another interesting thing about Venom is that it actually defends you from other sources of poison. So if I'm fully encased in Venom, you can see there's some poison here, and I can just go hang out in it. Oh, maybe is that not true anymore? It looks like that is not the case anymore. Okay, well that's news to me. That was the case on the last update, but apparently that is no longer a thing. That's one of the things you got to keep an eye out for. Some of this information might become stale, but that's why we're testing things right now. But that's really cool. That's really cool to see that Venom can inflict venom on others now. That's interesting, for sure. All right, and that is going to be it for my basic cell tutorial. Join us next time in part 2, where we explore the electric cells. Click here for part 2.